This is Chapter 11. In Chapter 11, we're going to be looking at evidence for evolution. So this is the start of our evolution unit, and evolution is just a theory that states that populations of organisms will change over time in accordance with their changing environment. And this theory can explain a lot of the different diversity that we have when we look at living things. An example of diversity includes mammals, which we'll look at in our next unit, which is looking at animal diversity. So here's an example of a montage of animals, and currently there are approximately 5,500 species of mammals that are living on the planet. So these are species that are right now included into our biosphere, into our ecosystem. And there are many thousands of other species of mammals that have gone extinct. Remember, this is just mammals, and mammals is a small subset of animals that we have on our planet. Besides having animals, we also have plants, we have the fungi, the protists, the bacteria, and the archaea. So understanding how all of these different organisms arose is part of evolution. So evolution is just a change in the overall inherited characteristics of a group of organisms. Specifically, we're looking at how a group of organisms called a population changes over multiple generations. And these changes can be in result of a changing environment, or as we'll see in the next chapter, we can also have evolution occur randomly or due to other factors or mechanisms. So a population is a group of individuals of the same species living in a defined geographical area. And we'll take a look at how we define species a little bit later because that can also be a little tricky within biology. There are 6 lines of evidence that support this theory of evolution. And we're going to go through examples of each of these different types, but I'll list them out here on the slide. The first line of evidence states that there are direct observations through artificial selection. So again, we'll look at examples of artificial selection, we'll also define it. We have evidence of evolution coming from the fossil record. We can also look at shared characteristics among living organisms and compare them to each other. A more modern type of evidence is looking at similarities and differences in the living organism's DNA. So now we can take DNA samples from lots of different species and we can compare those DNA samples to each other to see how similar they are or how different those DNA samples are from each other. There is biogeographical evidence, which relates back to the fossil record and looking at how and when and where fossils are found and kind of relating them to each other. We can also use this on living organisms. And then the final line of evidence includes looking at patterns of embryo development. So embryos occur right after fertilization when that one cell that was fertilized starts to go through mitosis or cell division to create an embryo. And if we look at embryos from multiple species, especially within the animal kingdom, they all look very similar to each other. So we will take a look at that. So first off, we're going to look at the first line of evidence looking at artificial selection. Artificial selection is when we have biological evolution for desired traits, and this is caused by humans performing something called selective breeding. So selective breeding, this is a process by which humans determine which individuals with desired characteristics will mate with each other. We have used selective breeding and artificial selection to create a lot of different agriculture plants and also other animals that we use for farming or to produce food. So a lot of our domesticated animals have come about through the selective breeding and artificial selection. Another really good example of this is looking at dog breeds, so domestic dogs. So all dog breeds that we have today, they can be linked back through DNA evidence to a wolf. So this gray wolf up at the top is a common ancestor. And that wolf, depending on where it was located, so we have different regions. We have Europe, North America, China, and India. So in these different regions, people preferred different traits. So they would selectively breed different individuals together to create different breeds that had different purposes. So for example, in Europe, over here, they bred tiny dogs, so companion dogs. They also bred terriers that were used for hunting. In India, they also were interested in breeding dogs to help out with hunting, specifically producing hounds that had really good sense of smell, so scent hounds, which led to all the different dogs that we use for hunting and also spaniels. So again, really good example of this artificial selection using selective breeding mechanisms. So this artificial selection, this is very similar to what we see in nature, which is called natural selection. So it's a very similar process. However, in natural selection, we humans are not selecting certain characteristics that we want within that species. In natural selection, the environment is selecting which traits help those organisms survive. So natural selection, this is a process by which individuals with advantageous inherited characteristics for a particular environment, so basically traits that help them survive and reproduce in an environment, those individuals will survive and reproduce at a higher rate than individuals with less useful characteristics. So an example here, if we have 3 individuals up at the top, we have a red individual, an orange individual, and a green individual. And let's say, for example, in the environment where these individuals live, red individuals are not able to survive, and so they are killed off. Whereas the yellow and green individuals, they do survive, and they produce offspring. Those offspring, they can look like their parents, or they can have mutations that occur, such as this green individual now produced a blue individual, but it also produced a green individual. So we have different characteristics again. In this case, the 2 yellow individuals are killed off. The green individual is also killed off, so they're unable to survive. Hence, they do not reproduce. Instead, in this example, now the blue individual will survive and produce offspring. So just within, 2 generations, we have seen that our population has gone from individuals that are red, yellow, and green, all the way to a population at the bottom that has all blue individuals. So this again is an example of natural selection if those blue individuals have a better ability to survive and reproduce in their environment compared to the green, the yellow, or the red individuals. So it's having some advantageous trait that allows you to survive and reproduce. So these traits that are selected for are called adaptations. And adaptation can also relate to the actual process. So an adaptation is either a trait that helps those individuals survive, or we can define it as an evolutionary process by which populations become better matched to their environment over time through this natural selection process. And we'll get more into this natural selection process in our next chapter when we look at the mechanisms of evolution. The second line of evidence that we're going to look at is the fossil evidence. So a fossil is a mineralized remain or impression that comes from a formerly living organism. So here are some examples of different types of fossils. We can have impressions that are left behind by plants. We can have fossilized bones. So for example, if you think about a dinosaur skeleton, we can have fossilized wood. We can also have organisms that are trapped in amber. So for example, right here. So these fossils that are collected, we can date them and place them onto a geological timescale, or we can use them to create a fossil record. So these fossil records are when biologists take those fossils, they date them, and they're using that information to reconstruct the history of life on Earth. These fossil records, they provide a lot of information, and they also provide some of the strongest evidence that species have evolved or changed over time. In addition, we can see that some organisms have lived for a very long time, whereas other species, they arose and went extinct very quickly. So it's a very good way to kind of see how Earth has changed and how living things have changed over long periods of time. It also contains a lot of really good examples of how new groups of organisms arose from previously existing organisms. And these types of organisms are called transition fossils. So in your textbook, they go through an example looking at whales. So here we have a fossil record looking at the history of whales and how the modern whales showed up or arose. And again, there are transitional fossils. So whales have been linked back or related to land mammals that walk on 4 legs and that have a long tail. And what they have found is that there is a transitional fossil that shows both characteristics of the land mammals, but they also have characteristics of modern day whales. And we can kind of see this if you start at the bottom. So here we have a mammal that is in a land environment, and as you go up, you can see that over time, slowly, these organisms have changed a little bit at a time to look more and more like a modern day whale. These transitional fossils, they are really good evidence of species with some similarities to the ancestral group, and these species have some similarities related to the descendant species. So here we have that example again. We have a species that has similarities between the land-living mammals, which would be that ancestral group, and modern-day whales. In addition, we can look at this and kind of look at those transitional fossils and compare them to other modern-day animals. So if we look at that transitional animal and compare it to a hippopotamus, modern animals that live in shallow water have very thick bones, so this helps to prevent them from floating and enables them to die very quickly. So these are similarities that we see between that transitional fossil and modern day animals that spend some time in the water. So these are called adaptive traits. So these are features that give an individual improved function within their competitive environment. So this again is kind of going back to natural selection and adaptations and how organisms and populations of organisms will change over time to become better adapted to their environment, and they'll have specific adaptive traits that help them to survive. So here are some examples of other types of adaptive traits, and they take many different forms. So one example, so echolocation in bats is used to catch insects in the dark, so they're able to still hunt and get food at night. So that one is used to catch prey. Another example is stick insects avoid detection by predators by physically and behaviorally mimicking plants. So these stick insects, they look like sticks to avoid predation. So there are a lot of adaptive traits that help organisms either find food or to prevent themselves from becoming food or the prey. There's other adaptive traits. So for example, polar bears, they have white fur to help them blend in with their environment. They also have a lot of blubber to help keep them warm. So any type of trait that allows an organism to survive better in their environment is an adaptive trait. Our third line of evidence relates to shared characteristics. So many shared characteristics result from organisms that share traits, and these traits have evolved from a common ancestor. So that basically means that they are related to each other in the distant past. So a common ancestor, this is an organism from which many species have evolved, and they have a common descent, so they share a common ancestor by two or more different species. So if two or more different species have a common descent with a common ancestor, they may have very similar or shared traits. One example of a shared trait is called a homologous trait. So these are traits that are similar in structure between different organisms that come from a common ancestor through common descent. So these are traits that were inherited from that common ancestor way back in the past. So here, for example, we have three mammals which appear very different from each other. So humans, whales, and bats, they have very different modes of transportation. So humans, we can walk, whales, they swim, bats can fly. But if we look at their skeletal system, specifically if we look at their upper arm bones, these upper arm bones have the same number of bones and also very similar patterns. So if we see here, we have an upper arm bone called the humerus. Whales also have that bone highlighted in the green, and bats, in addition, have that bone as well. Attached to that, we have two lower arm bones in humans. Whales have two right next to each other. Bats also have two bones. So you can see that looking at these colors that we have very similar bone structure. These bones can be different shapes, but we still have the same type of skeletal setup. So here's an example again of a homologous trait. So they have similar structure, although they may not have the same function. In addition, we can look at vestigial traits. So this is another type of trait that many organisms have because of common descent. But these features are inherited from a common ancestor, but they're things that are no longer useful. However, they still show up within these different species. So for example, some species of snake, they still have very reduced little hind legs or little hip bones within their skeletal system. So this again is an example of a vestigial trait. So it's still there, although it no longer serves its purpose that it did in that common ancestor. The fourth line of evidence states that looks at similarities and differences within our genetic material, which is our DNA. So if you remember, all living organisms on Earth, they use their DNA as their heredity or genetic material. So this is what we use to have all of our traits and characteristics. It's also the material that is passed on from one generation to the next generation. So what we can do is we can look at DNA sequence similarities. So now we can extract DNA from any type of organism that you can possibly think of, and we can sequence out that DNA and figure out what order and how many adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosines that individual has within a DNA strand. Then they can enter this information into a computer and see and look at how closely related two DNA molecules are to each other. So just for an example, we have different pairs of DNA up here. The yellow parts, so the yellow highlighting, this represents differences between those two DNA strands. So if we compare humans to chickens, you can see that there are multiple yellow highlighted parts. That means that humans and chickens are very different from each other, which makes sense. Humans are mammals, chickens are birds. If we compare humans to a mouse, which are both mammals, we still have a couple of differences, but not quite as many between the chicken and the human. So humans and mouse are about 83% similar to each other. If we compare humans with chimpanzees, we see one highlighted difference in this example. And when they look at the whole human genome versus the whole chimpanzee genome, so all of the DNA, we have about a 98.5% difference. So we're very, very closely related to each other based on the DNA sequence similarities. Our fifth line of evidence includes biogeographical evidence. So biogeography of a species, this is just looking at the geographic locations where we find its fossils are found or will be found. So an example of this, so in today, there is a species of fish called a lungfish. These lungfish are found only in northeastern Australia. When we look at the fossil records, the ancestors lived during the time of Pangaea. Therefore, the fossils for these lungfish are found everywhere, or pretty much on all continents except Antarctica. So the ancestors lived everywhere. Fossils are found everywhere. However, modern-day lungfish are only found in one part by Australia. So this is showing where they have found species. So on the red dots, these are where they have found species of lungfish. So we have some in North America, South America, Europe, Africa, on Madagascar, which is the island right off of Africa, India, and also in Asia. But right now, the only living species is found in that very tiny part right off of Australia. So this is showing that where these organisms lived in the past can be very different from where they live in modern day. The last type of evidence is common patterns of embryo development. So embryonic development, this is how an organism develops from a zygote into its full form at birth. And if we look at different organisms, so here we're looking at embryos, we have fish, reptile, bird, and human. These are 4 very different species when they are in the adult stage. However, when you look at embryonic development, the embryos do look very similar to each other. So all 4 of these species, they have a tail region. In humans, we lose our tail during development. We also have gill slits, so highlighted in kind of that purple color. So embryonic development is really interesting to look at because it is very similar at very early stages. However, as we develop and we become a fetus, eventually are born as a baby, these things change very drastically over time. But again, at very, very early development, right after fertilization, as a very tiny embryo, we see lots of similarities between a lot of the different animals. So this is chapter 11, looking at the different types of evidence that support the theory of evolution. And again, there's lots of different types of evidence from lots of different researchers from lots of different schools or research companies. So this is a theory that is heavily supported by the scientific community. So we'll look at more of this theory of evolution and how evolution can occur, not just by natural selection, but by other mechanisms in chapter 12.